Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. It looks like I am doing this for an audience of one at this point, making this sort of an interesting experiment. So what we're doing today is my first attempt at a new kind of programming, and I thought it would be good to roll it out to just the patrons. So this is a patrons only live cast, and will be available to patrons and only patrons once I'm done with it. So even though it appears that I'm currently only doing it for one person, I'm gonna do this live cast. It will be available. So what I want to do is sort of a news brief format, which will, instead of my typical live cast thing where I dive in on one thing for sort of 45 minutes and talk about it, I want to run through the things in the month of May that I thought were particularly significant, not covering every country that this channel tends to cover, but I think getting pretty close. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into it. I was tempted to do this thing in like a stereotypical 1920s newscaster voice, and I might even have done it. But unfortunately, the first thing we deal with is something that's actually quite sad, something I only really realized I'd be having to cover in this in the past 24 hours or so. And that is Minneapolis, specifically the George Floyd killing and the protests that have resulted, which have, it's unclear at this point. It's hard to see what is happening with these anti-police brutality protests, but it's looking like what's happening in Minneapolis might be bigger than the sort of protests that we've become used to in places or that have occurred recently in places like Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. And it's getting pretty grim. I've seen some unconfirmed reports on Twitter with sort of 200 buildings being burned down in Minneapolis. Not entirely certain that's what's happened. But I think it's important, as already Fox News, of course, is on the, damn these thugs and ruffians, they must be suppressed for the good of society, blah, 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 blah. But if this continues to intensify, I think you'll be able to see other media outlets going in that direction. And I think the most important thing to remember is that the reason this thing happened, the reason this is happening in Minneapolis, the reason that, Baltimore, Ferguson, some other places have, had this level of public disturbance. It's not because an understandably brutalized group got angry. It's because cops did something stupid and somebody died, or cops murdered somebody, however you want to look at it. And I think that's a really key thing to keep in mind here, especially if things do get worse in Minneapolis. You're going to see more and more people swinging towards like, how dare these kids be doing this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that's really the appropriate response. The George Floyd thing is just I don't want to call it uniquely horrific, because I think this sort of thing happens all the time. It's just not always documented. I mean, there's no defense. There's no plausible defense. There's always a spectrum with these killings. And if a police officer can make a credible claim that not that there was a real threat to their life, but that they thought there was a threat to their life, the legal regime in the United States, in most United States states, is so permissive that even if a cop can claim that he was scared in any way, then they can get off. But it's really hard for me to imagine how they can make that claim where 4 cops held this man down and choked the life out of him. It's pretty unambivalent looking to me. But who knows how this is going to develop? What's interesting is that Minneapolis actually has a recent history of prosecuting police officers. In fact, there was a much less ambivalent one than this one. This is one where I think in most states in the union, a police officer involved in a situation like this is 3 or 4 years back. I should have gotten the date on that. The cop would have easily gotten off. But in Minneapolis, this police officer was sentenced to 12 years in jail. And what happened was a woman surprised some cops who were sitting in a car, and unthinkingly, this police officer just shot her. That's the kind of situation where I mean, Philando Castile is obviously a really obvious one. That's the kind of situation where the cop usually gets off because the cop can credibly claim that they were frightened or thought they were in danger. I'm not saying that's an appropriate way to do things, but that's how things happen. In Minneapolis, in Minnesota, a different thing happened 3 or 4 years back. The police officer who murdered this woman went to jail for 12 years. What's interesting about that is that in this case, the woman who died was a white woman from Australia named Justine Damond. And the gentleman, the officer who is now in jail and should be for 12 years, his name was Mohammed Noor, and he was the first Somali, I'm not sure if he was the first, but he was noteworthy because he was a African American of Somali extraction who was on the police force. So the black cop went to jail for 12 years. I think this is just as a caution. I think this situation is being used as a look. Well, why hasn't this guy been prosecuted? Why hasn't this truly monstrous police officer who killed George Floyd? Why isn't he being prosecuted yet? I actually looked it up, and it seems like charges weren't actually formally entered against Officer Noor until 6 months after he had murdered Justine Damond, the woman from Australia. So I do think like we may have slightly unrealistic expectations of how this process works. I think it is important that for people to call the DA's office, for people to make sure that this happens, because it would be easy to imagine this sort of just floating away. Well, less so at this point. So it is important for people to make sure that this happens. But I do think the idea that they would be instantly arrested and charges being brought isn't consistent with how things work with cops. I mean, that's screwed up, and that's a broader issue. So what's interesting to me specifically about this happening in Minneapolis is it's not the sort of place where you would expect this to happen. True, I mean, we've all long abandoned the idea that racist policing is only a South thing, but Minneapolis isn't even it's not a place that's known as having problems. Minneapolis is actually known as an extraordinary success story. Much of the upper Midwest I'm not sure if upper Midwest, there's a great deal of controversy over like where the Midwest is, what's the upper Midwest, what's the lower Midwest, But there are a lot of Midwestern states in the United States that have very grim economic pictures. They're known as the Rust Belt, and they're sort of characterized by deindustrialization. Cities that were once prosperous, sort of in the middle of the century, in the middle of the 20th century, having fallen on hard times. Minneapolis is one, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, which is, it's confusing. It's the Twin Cities. There's Minneapolis and St. Paul, different cities. I think are they even in different states? Don't quote me on that. It is a dynamic region that is seen as being very successful. And it's grim to see that Minneapolis's national and international profile is switching very quickly from this sort of low-key, under-the-radar success story where more and more people are living. It can be the sizes of cities can be confusing in the United States. Minneapolis itself only has about 300,000 people, but the metropolitan statistical area, including St. Paul and surrounding suburbs, is about 4 million people. This is a big city. This is an economic dynamo, and it is a place that had been known recently as very positively. And not only positively in terms of like it's a wealthier place, a good place to get a job, a good place for young people, but also a place with a relatively impressive record on civil rights. So, Ilhan Omar, I believe, I should have double checked this, please don't quote me on this, but I believe Ilhan Omar, sort of Somali American member of Congress, who is distinguished herself as a crusader for social justice, both in the country and abroad. She represents, I believe, a place in that metropolitan statistical area. Don't quote me on that. So Minneapolis had this low-key, very positive reputation, and now it's becoming like Ferguson, a international watchword for crisis. And it is the footage coming out of this looks to me in a very cursory, preliminary way, looks to me to be worse than some of the stuff we saw in Ferguson or Baltimore. So this could actually this could be a very bad thing. And you could imagine, especially with Donald Trump in charge, this evolving into sort of a 1960s style long hot summer. For those of you who don't know, the 1960s, everybody loves to talk about how disastrous and partisan and messed up things are right now. In the 1960s, it was so much worse. And one of the characteristics of the 1960s was urban riots that killed mostly African American people, but just dozens of people in every city, just truly horrific, and had sort of taken out a lot of historic downtowns, for decades. The effects were still being felt in Washington, D.C., where I lived from 2003 to 2011 from the 1960s riots. So it's possible to imagine something like that developing. I think that's probably alarmist at this point, but I got to say, the pictures coming out of Minneapolis and from other protests all over the country are looking grimmer and grimmer. And sort of the Minneapolis town fathers, to be patriarchal, have got to be pretty like, what the hell just happened? Like, how did we get slammed by this? And I think I'm warming up. I think I might do a produced video on this, but like the simple lesson here should be very, very clear. Minneapolis has apparently a photogenic, young, progressive mayor, and this, that, and the other thing. If you can't get your police, your security apparatus in a city in line, then everything you do to bring back your city, everything you do to become a destination for investment for people, everything you do can vanish in an instant if you don't keep control of the thugs in your police department. I think that's a really key lesson that people absolutely should have learned from Ferguson, a place in the St. Louis, Missouri suburbs. That's like something that should sink in. I'm somebody who believes that our insanely over weaponized police forces are not something that were good or necessary or served a purpose. I think there are a number of other reasons why the massive crime wave of the 1970s to the 1990s subsided. But say okay, the reason that crime wave went away was the brutal policing. It's important to emphasize that policing this brutal is a relatively new invention. Of course, brutality to African Americans, other marginalized populations of the United States was always a thing, but this scale, this insanity, this level of brutality is a new thing. And it was consciously introduced as a response to a crime wave in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. This is becoming an issue in the 2020 US presidential election, by the way, because of Joe Biden's lead role in the 1994 crime bill, which is now seen as flagrantly racist. So if you're in this mindset where like, okay, this brutality was necessary to get back control, that's a very racially loaded term, of our inner cities, if this was something that had to happen because of that, well then, okay, maybe. I'm not agreeing with that, but granting that, I would think that if you were running a city of any size in this country at this point, you should have back when Ferguson was an issue, that was 2014, like 5 years ago, you should have thought to yourself, okay, the calculus has changed. This brutal policing that may or may not have been an asset in reducing crime has now become a liability, because everything that I've done, say you're a mayor or a city council person, like everything that I've done to try to rehabilitate my city, to bring back investment, to make it a great, exciting, famously good place to live, can be trashed in an instant. And that's what this cop did. I think his name is Derek or something like that. This is sort of unverified from Twitter stuff at this point, but my understanding is that this cop, no, it has been verified, has had multiple complaints, has been involved in the deaths of 5 or 6 people. So essentially this cop is a mass murderer, and he was protected by the police forces. He was kept on even after being involved in all of these deaths, and protected and endorsed. That's the kind of thing that, frankly, cities in the Rust Belt, New York City, the city I live in currently, nowhere in the United States can afford this kind of out of control, brutal policing. It is a crucial thing for any major city in the United States if they want to continue to move forward, attract investment, become known as a place that doesn't have horrible street riots. You got to get your police forces in check. That's another legacy of like the 60s, 70s, is that police forces are in this weird political bubble where they're not really accountable to any elected officials. I think that was consciously created for a number of reasons, mostly because a lot of people in the suburbs and sort of power structures of cities didn't want black mayors to be able to control the police forces entirely. Keep in mind, that's a massive generalization. One of the aspects of criminal justice in the United States is that it is incredibly diverse. There are in a European country, you've got an interior ministry and the police forces work for them. That's how it works in most of the world. The United States, you have got thousands of jurisdictions. Not even in states, not even do governors control all the different separate police departments. They've got their own funding sources, that the other things. So this is a generalization, but I do think that if a city, like one of the key aspects of the recovery, the ongoing city renaissance in the United States is mayors and democratically elected officials regaining control of their police forces. And if that's the obviously, the outpouring of horror over the death of George Floyd is a very important thing here. But if we're talking about lessons learned going forward, cities have to take back control of their police forces. They are essentially a rogue security agency in the United States, and it is not covered enough. Yes, the individual monsters and racists like this thug who murdered George Floyd are a problem, but the problem is the larger system and the independence of police forces and their ability to just run their own murderous programs. And that's something that's got to stop. All right, that is our first topic. I notice I have 3 people looking. If you're new to this, there's a place where you can do live chat in to the right of your screen. If you have any questions about Minneapolis, anything you want to discuss about that, dive in on the live chat, and I can respond to it in real time. Because unlike the live chats on the bigger channel, where I've got 100, 150 people watching at a given time, I can actually interact more directly. So if you got anything you want to say about this topic, just chime in, and I'll respond to it in real time. Next up, I want to talk about Libya. This is probably one of the most interesting things that's been happening in foreign policy and relevant to this channel. And yes, there will be a produced video coming at some point in the next couple of weeks. Falling behind again. But what has happened is in Libya, the offensive of Khalifa Haftar, the sort of strongman wannabe Gaddafi, who's supported by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, France, Egypt, Donald Trump, not the US government, but Donald Trump, his offensive undertaken with great fanfare to try to take the major population center in the city that started in April of last year has now collapsed almost entirely. And I think that's a very good thing. Khalifa Haftar, I've got a video on him called Khalifa Haftar, Libya's Curse or what have you. He is not someone I believe to be good for the region, for Libya, for the prospects of peace in Libya or going forward. So I think it is a fantastic thing that has happened here. However, I don't think that people should get too excited about the possible end of Haftar here, or the possibility of Haftar was attacking the Government of National Accord, which is the UN and US government approved official government of Libya, which made it very confusing that Donald Trump was supporting Haftar against the US approved, UN approved official government of Libya. And it is fantastic that Haftar's attempt to take that city has been defeated. That's a great news. It's rolling back. I've noticed a lot of people getting excited about the possibility that, now Haftar might fall. And it's true. Khalifa Haftar might fall. This is the strongman in the other side of Libya. However, I don't think it's particularly likely in the short term. He's consolidated this pyramid of power 3 years ago. You might have been able to argue that he was more legitimate in some ways because the parliament that he had, backing him up was elected more recently than the parliament that is the base of the government of national accord. You might have said that, but he's completely depowered the legislature, the House of Representatives, in his side of Libya. So he is a brittle dictator strongman that is completely reliant on foreign support. However, I think that the foreign support for his offensive into other people's territory has been cut out, and I think it's essentially given up on it. I do not think that Russia, France, the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, probably others, are willing to give up their foothold there. So what I think the dynamic here is that this is the product of a negotiation. And we saw something very similar in Syria. And the negotiating parties here are Russia and Turkey. Libya is being portrayed as, and I believe actually is, a big win for Turkey this month because everyone was like, oh, Turkey's going to pile in and make everything worse. But what happened was through some Turkish troops, a lot of Turkish drones. Turkish drone industry is a whole fascinating thing we could get into. If you want me to talk about it more, you can let me know in the commentary. We've got Loga contributing in the live chat, which is nice. So Turkey's contribution is what turned the tide. And there's physical difference here, but what also turned the tide is that Turkey brought in all these materials, the Syrian mercenaries, the drones, some sort of more technical assistance from its own military forces, Turkish naval ships, but also Russia pulled all its mercenaries back. And without Russian mercenaries, Khalifa Haftar's offensive was farcical. It was illusory, and quickly collapsed. So what's happening here, which also happened in Syria in February, is we're seeing the facts on the ground that look like they're the product of military forces being applied in a certain way are actually much more the product of negotiation. So it's actually more of a negotiation between Russia and Turkey. Haftar had been pissing off all of his patrons, Russia particularly, all over the world. So Russia said, look, if Erdogan's willing to put these resources in, it's not that important to us to give this sort of uppity client of ours control of the whole country because we're having trouble controlling him already. So fuck him. It doesn't mean that they're willing to pull out of the country entirely. So I think that if Haftar is going to fall in the next year, it's going to be, it could be because he's an old man, but it's going to be because the dynamics within the eastern, within the eastern Libyan section that he controls, because the dynamics within that lead to his fall. So yeah, I think people shouldn't get too excited about that. Sorry, and I was talking about how in February in Syria, like the same thing happened. There was this moment on Twitter where everyone was like, holy cow, like the Turks are going crazy. And they did, because Assad's government killed 30 Turkish soldiers. So the Turkish government then just all of a sudden was like, oh, you thought Syria was a war? Let's show you what a real war is. And in the space of 24 hours, took back half of the territory that the Syrian government had taken 3 months to take from rebels. I think there were a lot of excited people on Twitter like, OMG, Assad's finally going to fall. Turkey's just going to roll through. But actually, no, because that too was the product of a negotiation between Russia and Turkey. Russia acknowledged, oh shit, like 30 Turkish soldiers died. That's not cool. We can't let Assad do that either, because, if Turkish soldiers die, then maybe Russian soldiers will start dying. So he got on the horn to Erdogan. This is an impression, not definitely what necessarily happened. We got on the phone to Erdogan and was like, hey, look, this can't happen. Take back X amount of territory, but you can't go into Aleppo, or you can't go, within margins. The Turks very quickly rolled that territory back, but it was always within negotiated margins. Um, yeah, Logo Cool Extreme asks, I'm still confused. Is the US pro or anti-Haftar? Welcome to the world of foreign policy by Donald Trump. Because of his relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is due to straightforward bribery from Saudi Arabia, Trump is more friendly to Haftar than the US government is to Haftar. Does that sound ridiculous? It is ridiculous. The State Department officially supports the government of national accord in Western Libya, but Trump, through tweets and other things, endorsed Haftar's offensive in Tripoli, which is it's insane. It's incredibly poorly managed. It's nuts, but yeah, it's the Trump foreign policy in embryo. Muftugas, I also wonder why there is no NATO chatter like there was in the initial push into Libya for protecting the UN-backed government. I think I read France and Italy were not keen. Well, what's interesting is that France and Italy are competing. Italy, obviously, another aspect to all this is that Italy and Turkey both have imperial history in Libya. Libya, very sparsely populated territory, wasn't really important or valuable until they discovered the discovery of oil in, I believe, the mid 20th century. So it was sort of the leftover scraps that Italy could pick up to have an empire, and they took it from the Ottoman Empire. And I believe 1908, no, maybe it's 1911. Can't quite recall exactly. So that is another aspect here. But to Mert's question, I also wonder why there's no NATO chatter. So what's interesting is that the Italians and the French, both when Gaddafi was sort of welcomed back into the fold in 2004, when he gave up all his weapons of mass destruction programs, which there weren't much to, but when he sort of consciously opened up, mostly out of fear, I think, in reaction to what had happened to Saddam Hussein, France and Italy both barreled into Libya, tried to get into their oil industry, contracting, and the Turks did as well, actually. But then, of course, France and Britain and the United States decided to kill Gaddafi in 2011 and destroy the country. But what's happened is that Italy has become more aligned with the government of national accord and hopes to get access to oil contracts through that, whereas France has become more aligned with Haftar. So you've already got that tension within the European Union and NATO, which sort of basically cripples the idea of a unified front in Europe, which is also ridiculous. It is Libya is a small country. Muftuil, did I pronounce that appropriately? Points out that it was 1911 when Libya, when Italy basically robbed the Ottoman Empire. Well, took Libya away from the Ottoman Empire, which also led to a pretty horrific series of events that ended up with World War I and millions of dead people and the end of the Ottoman Empire. But that is a distraction. Is there any hope for Libya? Is a fantastic question. The incredible irresponsibility of the entire international community is just mind blowing. It's the UN has approved the government. People should line up behind it. Instead, everybody's trying to run their own policy, and it's just incredibly irresponsible. There's a good War on the Rocks article I read recently about how everything's deniable, everything's done with drones, and it's a really horrific precursor to things that we could see evolving in the 2020s and the 2030s, especially if the United States and China start doing proxy war bullshit. There's Libya. One of the saving graces for Libya is there's just so few people there. It's like 6 million people in a country that I don't know how big that. I mean, if you put that on the U.S. map, would that be like half of the continental United States? Just not a lot of people there. Like a bunch of cities, sort of hugging the coast with storied, endless history, and some oil emplacements and some old oases. So it's not a very highly populated place. So what's really horrifying is like, oh, can you imagine something along these lines happening in Egypt? Can you imagine something along these lines happening in any one of a number of African countries that are, that have not 6 million people, but 10 or 60 million people, or 200 million people. So it's pretty terrifying, honestly, and it's something that people should be paying more attention to and paying more attention to squashing. Local Cool Extreme asks, with the death of George Floyd, has BLM finally won the culture war on police brutality? That's a very interesting question. Something that I've sort of noticed and I was tweeting about is that I had a conversation with an elder relative, I think some of you know who that is, who is very Trumpy. And what was very interesting was that there's also a more minor but very culturally important controversy in the United States where a white woman in Central Park tried to call the cops on a black man who asked her to put a leash on her dog, as she was legally required to do. It was interesting as I had the opportunity to talk to this older sort of Trumpy relative, and what was fascinating was this is an older relative who in earlier controversies, Michael Brown and Ferguson, oh, well, he was no angel, or Trayvon Martin, he attacked, like this is what I'd come to expect from, and that could be unfair with this individual. Maybe he was secretly enlightened the whole time, but I really don't think so. But what was fascinating to hear from this very Trump-supporting individual was the fact that he was completely in line with the Black Lives Matter interpretation of these events. He was, oh, those cops in Minnesota should go to jail, and oh, that fucking Karen in Central Park. And it was really fascinating to see that. And I've said I've got videos up saying Black Lives Matter is winning, and I think that is absolutely something that's happening. That is something very hopeful about this, and I think ought to make, I would hope, would make it easier to make the kind of local government reforms that are necessary to make sure that we don't have any more Minneapolises. Minneapolis? Mert Muftul asks, I know off topic, but I wonder if EU can put forward a common foreign policy forward ever. I'm not so hopeful. Eastern expansion has made this even more difficult. Yeah, the idea of a common EU policy is the EU, I think there's a tremendous potential there, especially like in future decades. But the EU has got to sort out the problems with its currency, has got to sort out its finances, has got to sort out how to return to economic growth. Once those things happen and, the decades move on, the possibility, the plausibility of a combined European Union approach to things, it exists. It becomes like a thing. But the problem is in this nonstop crisis that they've been going through since 2008, really, almost nonstop. And now COVID on top of it. It's Europe needs to get its house in order before it can actually begin to pretend to have a unified foreign policy. So, yeah. So Turkey. Turkey's in this weird position this month where they had a foreign policy victory. Libya is, I think, rightly being portrayed as a foreign policy victory for Turkey, where the finances are just spinning further and further out of control in Turkey. It is, it's a serious problem. Mert, you might have something to add to this, but it's this weird dynamic where they look strong abroad. They've essentially taken Syrian territory. I did a whole live cast on this. Was that just last week? But at the same time, their economy is disintegrating. They've got a currency crisis going. The Turkish lira is now, I believe, worth even less than it was in 2018 when Trump started talking about sanctions over that evangelical pastor that was being held in Turkey. Things are bad economically. And what's interesting is that there's a broader emerging markets crisis going on that I need to find a better way to talk about. But in 2008, what was interesting was that emerging markets were very prepared for this disaster. Most of them had, not most of them, but many of them had currency reserves because of loose money in the United States. There was just much more money swimming around. Like the post-2008 era was actually fantastic for a lot of emerging markets. That is not proving to be the case now. Maybe it would later, but I'd be surprised. Monetary policy can't really get any looser at this point. And a lot of, unlike 2008, a lot of emerging economies have been slammed with this exact same economic crisis that everybody else has, and the physical medical crisis of COVID. So there's this ongoing emerging market crisis that's going on. What's interesting is that through cooperation between central banks, a lot of developed economies have figured out ways to keep things limping along. Basically, throwing out the idea of a balanced budget entirely, no longer being particularly worried about ballooning debt levels. And the way they're able to do that is because of the tremendously activist Federal Reserve, United States Federal Reserve. And what's interesting is that some countries have been allowed into this club, like South Korea, I know for sure, I believe some other larger developing countries that did not make a list, where they're allowed to enter into swap arrangements with the US government. And this essentially means, I haven't been looking at financial engineering this week, so what I believe it essentially means is that at a not too unfavorable exchange rate, these folks with the swap line agreements have access to tens of billions of US dollars to make sure that everything in their economy keeps going. Now, Turkey thinks it deserves one. I think if Turkey had remained politically aligned with the United States, not that that necessarily would have been a morally right thing to do or a sensible thing for Turkey's national interest, had it remained politically aligned with the United States and had its macroeconomic approaches been a little more orthodox, I think Turkey absolutely would be in this position where they were able to benefit from swap lines with the United States Federal Reserve, and the financial picture would be much better in Turkey right now. That is not the case, however. Erdogan is not getting that. There's a more budget thing that the Fed is offering. It's like, well, if you hold T-bills, if you hold a lot of U.S. debt, then the Fed is allowing folks who already hold a lot of U.S. debt to leverage that somehow. Once again, haven't been on financial engineering this week. And I don't know that Turkey can even really necessarily benefit from that. So Turkey is in dire, dire financial straits. They're not going to get U.S. swap lines. They have been supported mightily by China, and specifically Qatar is probably the most interesting one. It is, I think it's arguable at this point that funding from the Qataris, the Gulf country with the best outlook in terms of their continued viability, funding from Turkey has done a lot to help Erdogan stave off a true economic catastrophe. Though that's debatable. I mean, unemployment in Turkey is very high. It's a mess. So yeah, also just briefly on Turkey, there's economic orthodoxy, which I have some critiques for, like just the general idea of how a government and a central bank should be run. I think we have a general sense of like how that should be done, what should be done, but we don't necessarily know everything about how things should work, and I tend to be very suspicious when people are trying to issue diktats to emerging economies. However, in Turkey's case, what Erdogan wants to do, and now sort of my understanding is that he now more or less completely controls the central bank and it does what he wants to do now, instead of still being a little bit independent as it was as recently as a year or two back. His sense of how an economy should run seems to really not be working. It worked for a while because he's a strongman in a country where he controls most of the media. But it's not working now. Like when I moved to Turkey in 2011, I think it was about 1 lira 50 to a US dollar. Now it's closing in on 8 lira to a US dollar. Like it ain't working. But I'm hesitant to really say for sure, everyone's doing this wrong because of his interest rates and because I don't have any confidence in my interpretation of those things, and I have very little confidence in the interpretation of most official economists of that sort of thing. But I think it's safe to say at this point that Turkey's unorthodox approach to the macroeconomy and its central bank has failed and continues to fail. And Erdogan absolutely refuses to go to the IMF to sort of save the economy, because that is possibly quite rightly seen as humiliating. I think Erdogan made a huge show of paying off the last IMF loan. That was when I was living in Turkey. I don't have the year on that, but it was a big deal. Logo Cool Extreme asks, is there legitimate opposition in Turkey and Russia? I would say that there's more legitimate opposition in Turkey than there is in Russia. In Russia, at this point, after 20 years of quite strongly authoritarian government, I mean, there are opposition parties that are sort of, you get the sense they're sort of official, intentionally ineffectual opposition. Honestly, maybe I'm being too paranoid, but paranoia is rewarded often in Russia. I sometimes am even suspicious of Alexei Navalny, who's the very charismatic, arrested all the time guy. It's like, if this guy is, because this guy's been impressively oppositional to the Putin regime for a decade at this point. Yet most of the people who do that are dead, and he's still the most, or maybe you can't kill him because he is so flagrantly oppositional. I am wandering way off the reservation here. It's entirely possible that Alexei Navalny is a very real, authentic grassroots opposition figure. Possible. I don't know. Yeah, Russia, I don't think, because Russia's just so fucking lethal as well. They murder people a lot. Turkey does as well, but nowhere near on the same scale as Russia. I think the threats in Turkey for journalists and whatnot are more on the order of, you will never be able to work again. Or we will, especially since the coup in 2016 was thankfully averted, more and more journalists have been finding themselves in jail. And that is horrible, but that is not quite Russia-level repression. It does seem that elements within the AK Party and the Turkish government have a real commitment to mostly legitimate elections and winning those elections. So I think while the opposition is deeply hemmed in both Turkey and Russia, I would argue that Turkey is a much more legitimate democracy at this point than Russia is. Okay, so moving on to Syria. It's been interesting since that February, that huge February dust up over Idlib, where I believe from December to February, Syria, I don't know if they cut the Idlib pocket in half, but it was greatly constrained. And then, as we discussed earlier briefly, a bunch of Turkish soldiers were killed, and then in a number of days, Turkey took back a third or a half of the territory that the Syrian government had labored to take for 3 months. And I think that since then, things have stabilized in Idlib. What was an interesting thing, the celebrated moderate opposition's taking of Idlib in 2015 was always kind of a front for al-Qaeda. I know I could enrage certain people by saying that, but like al-Nusra or whatever the number of rebrandings they've gone through was always a massive part of the Syrian opposition, certainly by 2015, when Idlib was taken with massive support from the United States. So up until I think this year, or last year at some point, that's still that rebel pocket in Idlib that was, over the course of last year, completely taken over by the al-Qaeda affiliate. I think it's called HTS now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was still sort of nominally independent. And there were Turkish observation posts going up around there. But I think what's happened now, and I think what is leading, I think this is the dynamic in Syria. I could be completely wrong about this. I've been completely wrong in the past. I thought that those southern rebel areas in Syria were going to stay there forever, and then they just disappeared in a matter of weeks. I think what's happening now is that Libya pocket that used to be sort of this independent al-Qaeda outlet, and then there was a completely Turkish military-controlled pocket above it. I think that Idlib pocket, what's left of it, because it's been dramatically constrained, is becoming more and more officially a Turkish protectorate, especially after the events of February and March. So I think what's happening now is we're getting to a sort of consolidation phase. And I think more and more people are having to face up to just what a disaster Syria is. There was a lot of heavy rumor mongering about Russia and Assad falling out earlier in the month. It looks to me that that's sort of fading away. In my last live chat, I talked about how Russia is falling into a quagmire in in Syria. The very intelligent thing that they did from the beginning that made it not an instant quagmire is that they, unlike really anybody else, latched on, well, because there was only one, latched onto an actor in the Syrian civil war with a deep well of legitimacy and built up power. You can, Assad is a mass murderer. I would argue that Assad is a mass murderer because we turned him into one. I have not been quiet on this channel about talking, I believe the United States and its allies were the main creators of the disaster in Syria. But yeah, Assad's a very, very bad man, but he also has real decades-long established roots and legitimacy in that country. Russia, getting more and more desperate, running out of money because of the oil crisis, which is the oil price crisis, the oil demand crisis, plummeting oil prices, which is it's the crisis underlining almost every bit of geopolitical commentary on this channel for the past 6 years. But because of that, Russia is looking for ways to get out. And I think it would be probably pretty insane on their part if they tried to get out by abandoning Assad or finding some other actor that would work for them. Like the parallel that I talked about in the last live chat was, I'm going to massacre this. I need to be able to pronounce Vietnamese better, but it's Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the dictator of South Vietnam, who was an awful, corrupt nightmare of a guy. The Kennedy administration either directly did or acquiesced in his assassination, thinking that South Vietnam would be stronger without him, and we all know how that worked out. Did not work out well for the United States or South Vietnam. So I feel like the Russians probably wouldn't be dumb enough to throw Assad over the side at this point, as much as many people would like them to. So what's interesting is that if the territory is consolidating, if you've now got the Syrian government not facing a bunch of unruly Al-Qaeda types who are just going to fire missiles for fun, but if the Syrian government is facing Turkish soldiers on the other side, and Turkish soldiers who've been emboldened, and now the Syrian government people know that if poked, the Turkish government will respond with overwhelming force. I think it's possible we're going to see some stabilization. The biggest potential progress in Syria would be the withdrawal of U.S. troops and some kind of accommodation between Assad and the Kurds. But if we're at this point where we've, thankfully, reached probably not an end, but a long pause in military activity in Syria, we're now at a consolidation space. And that's one of the biggest, certainly just the biggest story coming out of Syria, which is this month, which is Assad's falling out with Rami Makhlouf, which is a family member of Assad. I believe his mother, his mother was a Makhlouf. Assad's mother was Makhlouf. And this is also sort of the Syrian oligarch, the Makhlouf family. Rami Makhlouf, I believe the main fella in charge of that Makhlouf family and its industrial conglomeration, took to the internet to condemn the Assad regime for stealing his money and stealing his, moving in on his empire, which is really a truly extraordinary movement. The Economist argued that Makhlouf felt able to do this without, automatically dying because the Makhloufs are very rooted in Latakia and the sort of Alawite minority that is one of the bases of Assad's power. So it was also very interesting, sort of suggesting that, and Makhlouf was suggesting apparently that it was Assad's openness to Syrian elements of the power structure that was cutting out Makhlouf. And I think that actually that suits the consolidation narrative, because when Assad was really just, he always held the majority of the population holding territory in Syria, but he had lost, that whole desert chunk. I mean, in land area, he was probably down to 20, 30% of the country. In population, he was always at 80, 90%. But, in those desperate times, he had to lean on the Makhlouf family and the Alawites to a much higher degree. Now that he's sort of consolidated the majority of the country, is feeling a little more secure, he's got to give opportunities to other people. So weirdly, I got the sense reading the Economist article, this is not something that you're going to find in any Western media. It was just the idea that like, oh, actually, this falling out in the ruling regime is actually potentially an attempt to do an anti-corruption drive by Assad to diversify his sources of power. So that's very interesting, very worth watching, but perhaps not as big a thing. I've been arguing, I think I did a video saying the Syrian war is essentially over. It was 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. And my argument now is the same thing then. The straightforward deal that will allow Syria to move forward, that will allow the regime to move forward, is normalization. A lifting of sanctions on Syria in return for verifiable acceptance and non-persecution of Syrian refugees. That's the deal. That's the deal we should have made 2 fucking years ago. That's the deal I'm probably still going to be talking about 5 years from now. What I think is likely to emerge is that the U.S. isn't ever going to stop trying to overthrow Assad. What we're going to get now, what we have now, is like a 1990s style, Iraq style pause, where we do everything we can to murderously sanction the country, starve the people to death, and the regime is just fine. That's what we did. The regime is just fine and is there for, I don't know, President Tom Cotton in 2028. To say, oh, we got to finally deal with Assad and do the boots on the ground and do the whole horrific Iraq process all over again. So I think that's where the U.S. government's current approach to Assad is leading. What we should have done in 1992 was provide Saddam Hussein a path towards normalization. Verify that you're meeting these certain human rights requirements, with inspectors, with folks coming in to see it. And then we'll lift the sanctions. You can start selling your oil again. We'll allow you've been chastened. We'll allow you to attempt to be a good citizen. I think that would have been vastly more effective for Iraq. That is something we should try in Syria. But I have a hunch we won't. I think it's going to be preserved as this potential place to have fights with, which is, I think, a fucking tragedy. So, yeah, that's Syria. Oh my gosh, there's so many questions. Is there legitimate? Is the Kemalist movement ideology fading in Turkey? Asked Local Cool Extreme. Mert Muftugil says Local Cool Extreme. The opposition parties in Turkey won the majority of the local elections in the largest cities, so there's still opposition. Wow, that's interesting. I'll get that. So yeah, that's a fascinating thing. I mean, I think that. Like George Washington, Turkey is never going to escape or completely, get out from under the influence of. Well, those are both negative ways to look at it. The inspiration that Ataturk provided, but time goes on. Time changes. George Washington was a slave owner who thought that it's more Jeffersonian, but probably as a Virginian was of the idea that the ideal America was everybody. Individual farmers, a republic of farmers, of probably owning slaves. That was George Washington's ideal. Obviously, we still idolize George Washington, have states, things named after him. Every 20 years, there's a prestige TV series about him. I guess the John Adams series on HBO. I mean, God, their portrayal of George Washington was just, he was barely there, but he was just this like, I'm almost getting goosebumps talking about that HBO series was 5-10 years ago with Paul Giamatti as John Adams. But yeah, their portrayal of George Washington was just as this sort of secular saint. But of course, George Washington wouldn't recognize anything about the United States today and be absolutely horrified. And I think that Ataturk will always be worse. I mean, let me know, Mert, if I'm going completely off the reservation here. But I think Ataturk will be off the reservation. That's a term I've used multiple times here that is probably super racist. Anyway, if I'm talking crazy here, let me know if I'm talking crazy here, Mert. But my sense is that Ataturk, like Washington, is going to be this figure that as long as there's a Turkish Republic, will be idolized. But the character of that idolization will change because time changes. That time changes things. But like, have the Turks abandoned secularism? Absolutely not. My understanding is that I should double check this because I think I keep referring to it. But in the run-up to the new constitution that was largely written by the AK Party, there were elements in the AK Party that floated the idea of like, gee whiz, in this new constitution, should we maybe say we're not a secular republic anymore? and they just got slammed down, like by people in the Ak Party, by everybody. So I think that the legacy of Ataturk, as with the legacy of George Washington, is changing every day, every year, every decade. But I think that the core of what he believed will remain at the heart of the Turkish Republic. I mean, let me know if that sounds crazy, Mark, but that's my sense of it. Local Cool Extreme asks, rank the police officers from least violent to most. Hong Kong police, Turkish police, New York police. Well, the thing is, for all of them, it depends on who you are. I was at a massive protest in New York City in Times Square, or I guess it was a protest in support of the impeachment in the United States. And was that February or something like that? Feels like a different lifetime. I was at a massive protest. And because it was a bunch of white people, mostly like old white ladies, the police were fine. Hong Kong police, can't speak to it. I have not done a deep analysis of Hong Kong. Turkey's really interesting because Turkey, I was a huge supporter of Gezi. I was out there getting tear gassed. I was on the barricades. But I gotta say, comparing the Turkish police reaction to like what as we're seeing as we are absolutely seeing right now in Minneapolis, to what a U.S. police force's reaction to a comparably sized thing, I got to say the Turkish police were pussycats. It was quite friendly. I think they were mostly focused on everybody's safety. And okay, like that would really piss off some Turkish people. I'm sorry, but like it was a nationwide uprising that lasted a month and 5 people died. I mean, it's amazing. Yes, police brutality is a problem. Everyone should be, happy, joy. But yeah, I mean, there were tons of people throwing rocks at cops, like the kind of thing that would have gotten people shot in the United States for sure. But the Turkish police, and we definitely see this double standard in China as well, Turkish police, Turkish military forces acting in the east of the country in more Kurdish cities where they can rely on Western press being thinner on the ground, can be very certain that there aren't any privileged children of Turkish elites in the crowds, where it's, mostly Kurds, then the Turkish police are vastly more brutal. U.S. New York police take a very different approach to white people protesting than they do to black people protesting. China, Hong Kong right now, I think is where we're seeing some very real repression under the guise of COVID, and it was very real repression from the get-go. But comparing the sort of street tactics that were used in Hong Kong to the horrific nightmare that's unfolding in Xinjiang province with concentration camps, with disappearances, with like a wholesale uprooting and crushing of a thousands of years old culture, and you look at the Hong Kong kids who are whining about tear gas, it's just like what? However, like I now have come around to like I think Hong Kong's freedoms are in the process of being crushed, as perhaps they always were going to be. But I'll hopefully talk about that a little bit at the end. Very important. Trump's social media order. Big fanfare, lots of tweets, a whole executive order drafted and declared. Ignore all of that shit. That's just horse shit. It's absolutely meaningless. I ran a video on what Donald Trump's true significance for tech companies is. That's his appointing of Federalist Society judges throughout the U.S. judiciary who are going to guarantee that real antitrust isn't going to happen for Amazon, Google, Facebook, or whatnot in the coming decades. So yeah, this horseshit dust up with Twitter with Trump is exclusively it's an attempt to distract. It's an attempt to distract from his failures with COVID and should be ignored. All right. COVID. So COVID, again, like I just don't like, I don't know what to say about COVID. I am not a medical professional. It's very clear that there are a lot of medical professionals who don't know exactly what's going on yet. I will say at this point, and I think it's probably something that will be a little something I may regret if, this mutates, gets 100 times worse or something, but I think we kind of got off easy. I think that as horrific as it is to be dealing with a disease that may have a 1% fatality rate, think how horrific it's going to be if in the next 10, 50 years, we deal with something that's got a 50% fatality rate. And I think the fact that a whole generation, not just in the United States, but across the world, has grown up and seen how devastating infectious diseases can be. I gotta hope, I gotta expect, we've all got to expect and make happen that our governments all over the world are prepared to dedicate more resources to this. So when when bird flu jumps to humans that next time, and 50 people die in southern China, the next day, everybody in the world is doing what's appropriate because as a result of this COVID disaster, we have put in place the resources, the international cooperation that are necessary to make sure that this never happens again. I think this may actually have been a good thing in terms of preparedness. Like I don't think there's anybody over the age of 5 in the United States who's gonna experience this year and say, yeah, we can do that again. So I think one crazy thing is so someone had brought to my attention is that kids born this year are almost certainly going to live until the 22nd century, barring civilization-ending catastrophes. So I think through the year 2100, I think people are going to be more serious about pandemics. I think that's a great thing. That's COVID. Oh, questions about COVID. Do you have access to N95 masks and hand sanitizer? I do not. I felt very smart. I bought my parents a whole bucket of hand sanitizer before those ran out in February, which was nice. But I don't know. I think that at least in the New York area and the East Coast, I think we're beginning to get a handle on this stuff. I haven't seen my parents, my elderly parents, in about 3 months. Which is weird because I don't want to see them because I could potentially give them disease. But I will see them briefly next week as I drive out to Michigan to quarantine myself, and then I'll be able to hang out with them 2 weeks after that. But yesterday I went and got 2 tests for free in 20 minutes in New York. Now, because the United States is the way it is, you can do that in New York City, which is a place that was very hard hit with COVID and is also very rich. You can't do that most places in the country. But yeah, I got a free, the jab in the nose test and a free antibody test yesterday at CityMD in New York City, which is fantastic. So I'm going to get those back before I start trying to think about hanging out with my parents. And that's interesting. So I think that some of the resources that we were worried about not being present in the United States are now showing up. And I do not have an access to an N95 mask, nor would I purchase an N95 mask if I had the opportunity. I've got surgical masks, I've got cloth masks, and I think in New York City, at least, the adoption of masks of some sort, whether everyone's wearing them properly, whether I'm always wearing them properly, is almost universal. So I'm pretty hopeful about the progress of the disease. I think we've probably turned a corner. I know there's a lot of people who are invested in us not having done so, and a very real chance that we won't, that it's all going to boomerang back on us in the fall, and it's going to be nightmarish in the middle of an election. But I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic at this point. Local Cool Extreme asks, why is the U.S. unwilling to mobilize to combat COVID? Is Trump to blame, or is this the natural state of the blob? So the blob is I'd say that's more generally applied to national security architecture, but also national security architecture is kind of all that's left. I do call it the metastasizing military-industrial complex for a reason. It's sucked away the blood vessels and the resources for the rest of the country and other vital systems. So yeah, the U.S. is unwilling to mobilize to combat COVID. It's mostly Donald Trump. What's crazy is George W. Bush, who's a guy who was rightly loathed for a whole lot of things, was a guy who was very serious about pandemic response. It was under his watch that both SARS happened and when everybody got really paranoid about bird flu, which I believe did hop to individuals in southern China and was just absolutely horrifying, but like was contained. So it really is about Donald Trump and his complete ineffectualness, his shutting down of bureaucracies that would have done a much better job if Donald Trump hadn't been there. And yes, I entirely agree. As I've been saying, local co-extreme, my man, this is a national security issue. Absolutely. It is. I don't think anybody can look at the Pentagon right now and say, well, it makes sense for them to have as much money as they have after, this nightmarish year where our economy almost evaporated. That money should be given to the National Institutes of Health, obviously to me anyway. Why does no one in the U.S. understand it? I think a lot of people in the United States understand it, actually. I think more of them will, and I think it's our duty to explain it. So yeah. Okay, that's COVID. Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is in this interesting place where, and I'm in kind of a weird place with Saudi Arabia where it's like, I'm the guy who's like, Saudi Arabia is coming down, but I'm the guy who is, and I still am, the guy who says Saudi Arabia is going to fall by 2030. I think that what we're seeing right now is an important step in that process, but I don't know that I think I'm actually, for the first time, I'm seeing people who are anticipating a sooner collapse, a collapse that's going to happen earlier than I've been assuming it. So it's nice to see, real thinkers about foreign policy to be beginning to come around in my way of seeing things, but I think they may be jumping the gun a bit. I think that Saudi Arabia and even MBS has a little more runway than they are acknowledging. But the facts are dire. After 2016, the foreign reserves for Saudi Arabia, after 2014, the oil price, and then I think 2016 got really bad before the OPEC Plus deal brought things up again. But I think by 2016, between 2014 and 2016, Saudi Arabian foreign reserves fell from around $750 billion to around $500 billion. And then from 2016 until this spring, they managed to keep it around, the 480s, 490s, 500 billion US dollars, while they were also doing, a lot of other things, like taking on an extraordinary amount of debt. Debt to GDP ratio in Saudi Arabia is now 31%, which seems low, but my understanding, actually I read something this morning that made me think I might have been wrong, but my understanding is that as recently as 2014, Saudi Arabia's debt to GDP ratio was like 0. So this all of a sudden hitting 31%, going from 0 to 31% in 6 years' time is pretty troubling trajectory. But anyway, up until February of this year, Saudi Arabia was managing to hold on to that sort of 500 billion level of foreign reserves. In March, it plummeted by 25 billion. So at that rate, Saudi Arabia's got about 18 months left, with 19 months left, which is insane. And also, when the reserves start getting down into the 100 billion range, then I think things will start going much more quickly, because they'll want to take on a whole bunch more debt, and they'll want to do more austerity measures that will, result in the kinds of street action and unrest that will eventually take down Saudi Arabia. So that was like, holy cow! You've got the debt to GDP ratio skyrocketing. You've got foreign reserves plummeting. But Saudi Arabia still is an authoritarian country and had a number of actions it could take. I think a really interesting dynamic that has been happening, that has been largely successful, not largely successful, but has been helping in Saudi Arabia, is that over the past 5 or 6 years, the population of immigrant labor has gone down dramatically. And now more and more Saudis have to actually participate in the economy. What happened on May 11th was pretty extreme, and I think it was an acknowledgement that Saudi Arabia knows it's in some serious trouble, and is starting to take the steps that it needs to. They had initiated a value-added tax, I think, just at the beginning of this year. May 11th, they tripled it. I think it went from like 5% to 15%, which is very high sales tax. There was a special stipend that all civil servants in Saudi Arabia got, and that's a huge, in Saudi Arabia, civil servants are a huge percent of the population. I don't know, I don't have it off the top of my head, but I'm guessing like maybe 40%. Those stipends were ended on May 11th. They're not coming back. So there are steps being taken, and also it's been clarifying to think about like the oil industry and how it looks in the medium term. In the medium term, it means a whole bunch of producers are no longer viable. Saudi Arabia is going to remain viable. So I think while I absolutely remain completely committed to the idea that Saudi Arabia is going to have a completely different system by 2030, I don't know that we're going to see a instant collapse, in relation to this particular crisis. This is sort of the second massive oil price crisis, the first one being 2014 to 2016 with the OPEC plus cartel bringing things back up a little bit. This is the second one. I think it'll take the third one. I think we might actually potentially, as I've talked about on the channel, see a real spike in oil prices as the U.S. Oil market, just sort of disappears. And then that spike will go up. And yes, some of the shale will come back, but not a ton of it because people will know that there's a trough coming. So I think after that, I think that's when Saudi Arabia falls. What's a more interesting and more open question is whether or not the MBS will survive. Because I think my trajectory for how Saudi Arabia goes is sort of MBS will go first, and then the system will follow him, 2 or 3 years later. So that I think is still possible. I mean, we'll see how the Saudi people feel in 2021 or 2022 after they've been paying these much higher sales taxes. They don't have immigrant labor to help them anymore. They're actually funding their government for the first time. I think it's entirely possible that there could be some very serious demands for more power in that government. And I think that the response to that is likely to be extreme and violent, as most of MBS's responses have been, which will, of course, lead to a larger reaction. And I think it's within the realm of imagining. Saudi Arabia's, MBS came to power because Saudis recognized they needed a dramatic change. Unfortunately, he's a dramatic change, but nuts. Nothing he has championed has turned out well. So I think it's quite possible that MBS, 2021, 2022 could be the end of MBS, but we'll see. Anything can happen. Okay, questions. Mert Mutfuil asks, I cannot believe people made mask wearing a partisan issue here. We missed the mark on American exceptionalism on that. Yes, that's true. It's fucking nuts. I do think, though, that I know Loga probably doesn't like this, but I do think that the media in the United States is underestimating the power of cars. Outside of a few, mostly East Coast cities where we saw the really horrific, the worst outbreak, really one of the worst outbreaks in the world. The United States is a car culture. And if a lot of people, and I don't think, even among Republicans, if you look at the stats, like most people think mask wearing is a good idea. So I do think that we may sort of dodge the bullet here, mostly because of cars. Local Cool Stream asks, of all the countries in the world, which country has the bleakest prospect in the future? I would say probably either Nigeria or Egypt are probably my highest. There are poorer countries, of course, but I think, Egypt is a country. There was some amazing comment that somebody left. It was like, Jesus fucking Christ, 50 years ago, Egypt was going toe-to-toe with Britain, France, Israel, the United States. Now we're going toe-to-toe with Ethiopia and Sudan. It is a tremendous, sorry, that maybe it's seen as a little offensive to Ethiopians and Sudanese, but it has already been a tremendous fall from grace for Egypt. It can't feed itself. The historic breadbasket, can't feed itself. It's mostly propped up by Israel and the United States, the current regime. I see grim things for Egypt. Nigeria is a country that actually, tends to overperform. It's tremendously chaotic and violent, and but what really amazing was everyone was horrified when Ebola broke out. I think right next door, it was in West Africa to Nigeria, and a case showed up in Nigeria. This is back in that big outbreak back in 2014. And people were like, oh, fuck, this is going to be bad. But actually, it turned out like Nigeria had a very competent public health response that squashed it, which is fantastic because that could have been a horrific catastrophe. Unfortunately, like that public health response, I think most things in the Nigerian government tremendously reliant on a high oil price, and that is not something that they have anymore. And it is a very populous country with a lot of, I think most people would agree that not a very highly defined national idea. Folks are still pretty rooted in regional identities. It's a place that without the sort of grease of oil money, I am afraid I can imagine it falling apart. It's quite possible that the Nigerians will, surprise the world again, and I hope and pray that that's the case. But I am a little suspicious, a little worried about Nigeria, and Egypt and Nigeria are probably the only, really, I mean, the main places I'm pretty bleak about. Venezuela as well, obviously. Things are not going great and are not going to go greater. It's kind of impressive that most of the places that I have bleak prospects for are petrostates, oil regions, and Egypt has managed to somehow in the 21st century have bleak prospects without being a big oil and gas producer, which is quite sad. Mert Mutfield's logo extreme, probably countries subject to extreme climate change and those that cannot align with either U.S. or China et al. Blocks. It's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think we're quite to the needing to join blocks yet, but yeah. And Local Cool Extreme says, I don't think that countries want to pick a side. I think I don't need to. All right. Mark Murphy says, oh, yeah, I'm sure many not want to, but I wonder if there's a devil situation, more of a necessity. And Local Cool Extreme says, and I agree, that the world is wealthier than it was in the 1950s and 1990s. I think there's a real scope for like a non-aligned movement today that actually ends up being more powerful than China or the United States. Can you imagine like a non-aligned agreement where like Germany led it? I think that'd be Germany and Russia led the non. Can you imagine if Germany and Russia led a non-aligned movement? I think that would be something that could conceivably constrain the United States and China, and I think that'd be fucking fantastic. So, yeah. Local Cool Extreme says, define dodging the bullet, considering U.S. deaths are exceeding World War I fatalities on COVID. Yeah, no, I mean, no argument. It's terrible. It's horrific. This is what infectious disease does. And as much as I hold Donald Trump personally responsible for this, it's not the same as World War I. It's not the same as a war that politicians created out of nothing. It is a natural disease that came and killed a lot of us and killed a lot of people in countries with leadership that I see as more respectable. So yeah, like I'm not someone who thought that I was going to go through my life without seeing a massive pandemic. I'm a very optimistic person in many senses, but I expected a horrific pandemic, and we got one. And it's honestly like not as bad as it could have been. So that's how I define dodging a bullet. And I think if we end up taking the appropriate steps in reaction to this, then I think things could be pretty great. Logo Cool Extreme asks, what has this crisis irreparably damaged? It's a really good question. I'd have to think about that, honestly. One of the things, probably a good thing, is it's certainly kicked a lot of ideas that nobody would consciously say they hold anymore about sort of Western, European, American superiority right in the teeth. Everybody in Asia did a better job with this than the United States and Europe did. And I think that it would be very good to give another kick in the teeth to sort of ideas of white supremacy. I'd say that U.S. power has been like irretrievably diminished, but I don't necessarily think that's true. I think we're very lucky in that China has just been so shit at managing their sort of PR response to this. I think as poorly as we've managed this, as stupid and ineffectual as the United States looks on the world scene right now, as laughable as we look, we're still not as scary as China. It's been one of the great benefits that the United States has had throughout the 20th and 21st centuries is that our potential rivals are a lot scarier than we are. So yeah, I think while I do think a lot of ideas about U.S. and European competence have been shattered, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think like as far as like irretrievable changes to power relations, I just don't think I don't see it. Mert Muftuil says the current UNSC structure would make a non-aligned initiative, though, but yeah, it'd be kind of awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Like the UN Security Council, like a non-aligned movement would consciously, and I don't think there's a real reason why the UN General Assembly can't say like, oh, look, we've got an advisory board that just happens to be an advisory board where all these nations get together and, organize a WHO and a WTO and a system of international law that we insist everybody be constrained by. There's all kinds of absolutely like a real non-aligned movement could end up with like maybe some kind of rotating Security Council structure could, I think, plausibly replace or supplant the UN Security Council because it's fucking ridiculous that France, the UK, Russia are all representing Europe on the Security Council. That's obviously not something that makes sense anymore. Yeah, it's actually look at this give and take. I think I'm sensing a video. I'd need to actually do some research on the non-aligned movement, but yeah, I think that's a very interesting idea. Logo Cool Extreme says, I hate to brag, but we're still at 7,000 cases and about 120 deaths. And this was during a political crisis. Well done, Malaysia. Hey, Logo, is it Malaysia or Malaysia? What do you say? Well done, Malaysia. And yet we're only 1/10 the population of the United States. And the restaurants have started opening in Malaysia. Yes, everybody has done a better job in the United States. It's pretty extraordinary. I think like per capita deaths and whatnot, and cases, there are some worse countries in Europe, but we're the United fucking States. And a lot of the reasons why things are so bad in Europe is probably because they thought they could trust the US CDC, which they couldn't under Donald Trump. Farzam asks, wouldn't the new potential non-aligned movement turn into a formality quickly? Well, it depends. Frankly. I mean, who knows? What do you mean by turn into a formality? Anyway, don't know. It's not an idea I've thought about tremendously hard, but yeah, Farzam, let me know what you think by as a formality. It's a great thing when there's like 4 people here. I can respond to every single comment. It's amazing. Okay, so we did COVID, we did Saudi Arabia. Bolivia, man, makes me so angry. I did a sort of tweet thread this morning. Some of you who may follow me on Twitter at Rob Law saw it. Like, I read an article on Bolivia, which is just so infuriating to me. There was a coup in Bolivia in October that was enthusiastically supported by the U.S. government, the Organization for American States, which proved itself to just be an arm of the U.S. government, which is not very good for the Organization for American States, and enthusiastically supported by The Economist. As I said on Twitter, it's like The Economist seems to like, The Economist is like publication I used to read cover to cover. I still read it. I still receive it every week, read a lot of it. But as I've gotten older and actually read more history, I'm like, I've become to realize that as valuable as The Economist is, it has extraordinary flaws. And I think its coverage of Latin America is probably the worst. And I talked about in the tweet thread, it's like British people acknowledge that they've got a really nasty history in a lot of places. They got to be a little more politically correct, a little more humble as they push forward the Pentagon and the UK government's policies. In Latin America, it's like straight out of the 19th century. Like people who respect British business interests and American business interests are good. People who are bad for U.S. and British business interests deserve to be violently overthrown. That's everything The Economist says about Latin America, and it's really disturbing. I read this Bolivia article that was in the May, maybe it was last week's issue, that just has outright lies, outright disproven horseshit in it, which is, I've noticed that more and more, that The Economist will just lie to you. It'll just, take some rumor and report it as fact. It's worst with Latin America. So specifically with this, in October, the opposition accused Evo Morales, the socialist, indigenous, it was president, right? President of Bolivia for, I think, over a decade, of trying to steal the election. This accusation was instantly endorsed by the U.S. government, by the Organization of American States, and a whole bunch of media organizations, including The Economist. In February of this year, the Washington Post, the defense contractor newsletter, ran an analysis saying, oh, actually, we looked at the figures for the election, and turns out, no, this was all legit. It was bullshit. It was an excuse for this coup that happened. Evo Morales had to flee the country. And no, to be clear, like, Evo Morales should not have been running for this next time. It was dumb on his part or what have you. Like, he certainly took actions that undermined democracy in Bolivia. But what really undermined democracy in Bolivia was the right-wing coup that happened. And we're now 6 or 7 months later. There has been no election. The woman who put herself in power has proven to be less and less interested in elections, is more and more authoritarian. Indigenous people, leftists, are being persecuted in pretty horrific ways. It's an old-fashioned 20th century dictatorship. The Economist, this article that I read in this week's or last week's Economist, acknowledges this. That's where the information comes from. Like, as much as irritating as the biases of these organizations are, Economist, New York Times, some television media, what have you, like, they're also essential because they have real reporting. People pay for subscriptions to these things. So, like, without them, we're left with what the government is saying. The governments are saying. So, like, it's real journalism that they're doing there, and they're talking about the way that people are being abused by this government, why, how the coup plotters that they'd endorsed are turning bad. They're not, of course, at all regretful about their endorsements. But what's interesting is that throughout this article that provides valuable information about what's happening in Bolivia, they persist in this lie. They repeat it at least 3 or 4 times, saying that the coup happened because the last guy had tried to rig the election. But we know, not from, like, In These Times, not from Democracy Now!, not from The Intercept, but from the fucking Washington Post. We know from the Washington Post, whose owner, like, just lives for defense industry contracts. We know that it's not true. The Economist is lying when they say that the last Bolivian leader tried to rig the election. We know it's not true from the Washington Post. And that just really infuriated me. So Bolivia is, of course, dealing with the effects of COVID. They're in a position where a lot of Latin American countries are, where they're like, we simply cannot afford to get this disease. So they're being much more extreme with lockdowns. And I think Bolivia, and yes, the president, the regime that I dislike, to an extent, are doing what they have to do. However, that can also lead to repression. And the Economist article is good in describing how that's happening. So yeah, I have hopes that Bolivia has a real election, but I'm not very optimistic. And it irritates me the way that people just sort of let this coup happen because, like, Chavez, look, you know what, like, fuck Hugo Chavez and Maduro, especially. Like, yeah, they were definitely to some extent persecuted by the CIA and this, that, and the other thing. But they were also living off of U.S. drivers and have proven to be running, have turned Venezuela from a reasonably middle income country into a desperately poor one. Fuck those guys. Evo Morales in Bolivia did extraordinarily well, not just economically, but he did do very well economically, but also to see an indigenous person in power in South America is tremendously important. And to see him thrown out this way and living in exile and taking what was under him a very stable, prosperous, improving country and turning it into a 1980s style right-wing dictatorship. The woman who declared herself president, came in to the president's mansion with a big ass Bible and talked about how the devils had been chased out. Whether that was referring to Morales's atheism or his, I'm not sure he was atheist, or just the fact that he was indigenous. Well, I'll let you decide. So yeah, Bolivia pisses me off. Tunisia, I figured if I'm doing a news brief, I should talk about my favorite country in the world and how it's doing. Tunisia finally has a government. They had elections in October, formed their government in February, just in time, unfortunately, for the COVID disaster. However, as a well-run country, I'm sorry, Loga, but Tunisia's got you beat. They have got only 1,000 cases and 50 deaths, and they're coming out of lockdown. Unfortunately, Tunisia, like, another institution I'm a big fan of, is like the European Union, just can't catch a break. They've got their new government, that would hopefully be able to make some big changes, and instead they just get another hole blown through their balance sheet by COVID. As I talked about a lot before, Tunisia is an extraordinarily hopeful place that everybody should know more about. I've got 5 video series on Tunisia. It's the place that came through the Arab Spring successfully and established a democracy. It's an amazing place. The really frustrating thing is that its dictatorship up until 2011 had 2 prosperous petrostates on either side. And Tunisia in the middle was able to profit from this, was able to profit from European investment. It was even before democratization. It definitely had a series of 2 strongmen, but they were like, the first one more than the second one were sort of reasonably enlightened. Like, it was a place that was able to do well, and these strongmen were able to justify their power by redistributing all the money they had because they were right in between 2 prosperous petrostates and were a tourist destination from Europe and this, that, and the other fucking thing. Since democracy has been established in Tunisia in 2011, they've had a never-ending war next door in Libya, and the oil price cratered, so Algeria is unstable as well. Europe, the sort of tourist bonanza for Tunisia, has also had a really grim sort of 1% a year growth time. So it's this really frustrating position where it's like these horrible things keep happening. So it makes me fear for Tunisia's democracy because people living in Tunisia have got to be like, well, shit, like everything was better under the dictatorship because everything in the region and the continents around Tunisia was better before 2011, before the U.S. destroyed Libya and before the EU with its currency managed to just, begin its decade of chaos. So, yeah, Tunisia. I remain hopeful, but they remain screwed. And also, the U.S. is not being helpful. The Europeans are not being helpful. It's insane to me that Tunisia, Tunisia isn't getting like a Eastern Europe, like Poland style, just like fire hose of money, because it is tremendously in Europe's interest that North Africa becomes a stable democratic area that can absorb migration and hopefully, help to extend, stability and democracy through the rest of the continent. But no, nobody really gives a shit about Tunisia, despite the extraordinary job that they've been doing, and that makes me sad and angry. Yemen is interesting. Right now, I'm sort of diving into what exactly I want to say about Yemen. There should be some Yemen videos coming shortly. I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't done any Yemen videos in like 8 to 10 months at this point. which is unfortunate because I like to be someone who talks about Yemen a lot, because we should be talking a lot about the way that the U.S. is destroying Yemen. So I talked with the last videos I made. I was basically like, look, Saudi Arabia's lost, and that's pretty much the next Yemen video I'm going to run. Look, Saudi Arabia has really freaking lost. With Yemen, with Syria, with Libya, if you ever look at a map of these countries that talk about who controls what, you've got to always keep in your mind, where are the deserts? Because if you look at Libya, like it's like, it looks like, oh, Haftar's got the entire country except for this little pocket here up in Tripoli, but it's the pocket where like at least 50, 60, if not 90% of the people in the country actually live in Libya. In Syria, it's the same thing. I talked earlier about how in, say, circa 2015, before the Russians intervened, like Assad just had this little corridor, on the coast and to the west of the country that seemed like he controlled, but that was also where 90% of the people in Syria lived, because that was a big desert. Yemen's the same thing. So the Houthis have controlled 80-90% of the population the whole time. What's happening now, what's important, is that they are now moving in on Marib, I believe is the name, which is a city. It looks on the map like, oh, that's still very much a Western city in Yemen, but it's actually kind of like the eastern outlet of. It looks like it's a Western city, but it's actually probably like the furthest west city at that latitude. Because to the west of it is to the east of it is just the Rub al Khali is one of the world's most storied deserts. So if the Houthis successfully take Marib, which it looked like they were about to do before the COVID thing, made everything more nightmarish, then basically I think the Saudis are kind of shut off from like being able to communicate between Saudi Arabia and the southern area that they nominally control, which they don't really control either because of fighting between the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Hadi government, Hadi is a guy who's been in Saudi Arabia pretty much unbroken throughout the course of the conflict. He is not the Yemeni president, though Saudi Arabia and its U.S. allies still insist on this. So, so the United States and Britain can sell weapons to Saudi Arabia to destroy Yemen. That's an important development. COVID is horrific in Yemen, as many things are horrific in Yemen. It's sort of an interesting thing. I think it looks like it is going to be even more. COVID is going to be even more devastating to Yemen than the cholera has been, which is pretty horrifying. It's just a country that just keeps getting crushed. And Saudi Arabia, despite saying, ooh, we're doing a ceasefire, has maintained its humanitarian blockade of the country. And I believe there's even humanitarian funding to Yemen has been going down in the face of COVID. It's just extraordinary how comprehensively we have failed this country. And I'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks. Last up is Hong Kong. I think we're seeing the end of the sort of one country, two systems experiment in Hong Kong, which is something that I'd sort of feared since the protests got started. I just never really, everyone was so hopeful about Hong Kong, and I was just like, what are we going to do? We're gonna invade China and take it back. There's going to be a referendum, and like Hong Kong is going to be independent. I never really had a positive. I didn't think anything positive was going to come out of Hong Kong at any point. The Hong Kong protests, and I think it's beginning to yield what I assumed it would yield. My understanding is that there's all kinds of serious like economic and business ramifications to this. Pompeo apparently said that according to the U.S. government this week, Hong Kong is no longer autonomous. That could really impact the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, the whole manner of things. I don't know exactly how that works. I think that now that Pompeo has decided that Hong Kong is no longer officially autonomous from China, this is the U.S. government determination, The U.S. government has to determine what exactly that means. Does Hong Kong still deserve the privileges of certain autonomous features in terms of business and investing? Or is China already sort of, because my understanding is that China, in part in response to the trade war, in part in an attempt to make the Chinese currency more important and the Chinese economy more important, has actually been taking historic opening up movements, economically speaking, for investment purposes, not obviously politically. So yeah, what exactly it means that Hong Kong is seen to be losing its autonomy because of a new security legislation, I don't know. I've got to do more research. I think what's more interesting for this, and I think it's actually changing my thinking a little bit, is like, what does it mean for Taiwan? Because one of the main reasons is financial, actually, I think chiefly, more than this, but that's no longer as necessary. But I think one of the main reasons why China was willing to allow, by treaty, Hong Kong to have a more or less autonomous government was because it wanted to entice Taiwan into a more formal relationship with China. It looks like China might be giving up on that. Also, this could be overstated. It's quite possible that China will introduce this new national security law that subjugates Hong Kong in certain ways, but allow most things to sort of go along as they were, while of course persecuting people who get out of line and ask for real rights. But you know, what does the Trump administration really care about that? Almost not at all. Who knows? I mean, who knows? It's still very up in the air. But it does look like the one country, two systems regime that has been controlling Hong Kong since 1997 and was supposed to go until 2047 looks like it may be shaky. And that quite possibly, so you saw some tweets to this effect. I'm not sure I agree with it, saying that actually might be one of the most important things that's happening this month geopolitically, but the ramifications for it are so immense, and I'm having trouble wrapping my head around it at this point. So I don't know. We've got 5 people watching now. This is very exciting. Very grateful to all of you patrons who are here and watching, and I hope this has been at all useful. This is an unlisted YouTube video, so it will not show up at any point unless I decide to unlock it for some promotional purpose on my YouTube channel. However, it will be available on the Patreon feed for all time. So that link will be good, and you will be able to access this. Questions? Logo Cool Extreme says, I believe, about Venezuela, right? Morales' enemies. Oh, yeah, Evo Morales says, I'm genuinely embarrassed that at one point I supported Morales' enemies. You shouldn't feel bad about it. Bolivia is not a country that people know about or think too much about. You know, if the New York Times tells you that, you know, this guy's a strongman in Bolivia and he's trying to steal an election, and he said, you know, he blew through term limits, and we've been trained to think Putin, you know, you know, you sort of don't hear about he's this incredible crusader for indigenous rights and actually was incredible for his country, for everybody in his country economically. So yeah, and I think it's a real disconnect with reporting on Latin America, because a lot of people, I think I got in trouble with and like there's a real disconnect because people just sort of assume that you know, it's a place that has been abused by the United States. So like anybody who's in these countries, you know, is a good person worth trusting, where it's actually sort of like, actually the United States has abused these countries through people like the people who are in charge of Bolivia right now. That's been a key part of that. And I think there are very justified, very real concerns about US racism often allow us to ignore a lot of sort of really troubling and racist developments within South America. And I think that's why, I mean, who knows a lot about Bolivia? You know, not a ton of people. I'd probably read like 3 articles on Bolivia in 5-10 years before the coup in October. So yeah, I wouldn't feel too bad about falling into that. But that's why we're here. That's why the More Freedom Foundation is here, is to hopefully counter program these things on a few countries that we actually do know a lot about. Logo Cool Extreme asks, will the U.S. end the massive wealth inequality between boomer generation and the millennials? No, they will not. It's like ending inequality is impossible. Should the U.S. take certain steps? Absolutely. I think the income tax has got to be jacked up, dividend taxes, estate taxes, all of it, jack it up. Not sure if wealth tax really works. But the U.S. absolutely would be more effective at implementing wealth tax than anybody else would, because we control certain international financial plumbing, both legal and technological. But yeah, no, I think there needs to be a tremendous step up in taxing of the wealthy, not just income taxes, because actually, I mean, that people who are making high incomes, do tend to be. Some of them tend to be rather young and in their prime earning years. It is natural that old people are richer than younger people. However, what has developed in the United States right now is unnatural. And the fact that there are, estate taxes are, I think they don't kick in until like $20 or $50 million now. And it's just, there's so many ways to get away from paying your fair share in the United States now. What's really interesting here is you'd say like, oh, do we need a 1986 style tax reform? It's like, actually, you don't even need much more legislation. You just need a Democratic administration who comes in there and makes funding the Internal Revenue Service a priority. Because under Obama, I mean, and other presidents, there was so much, not because they cared about tax revenue, but because I think mostly for terrorism, anti-money laundering, that kind of thing. The IRS has extraordinary legal powers that it hasn't been able to develop because the Republicans have been consciously underfunding the IRS for 20 years now. I mean, this is the institution that makes sure the government gets enough of its money. And there's all kinds of figures where like people don't get audited anymore. One of the most important enforcement mechanisms of the Internal Revenue Service is like looking at somebody's tax return and the paperwork they provided and saying, hey, that doesn't seem right, and then they go and audit somebody and demand like larger rewards. That doesn't happen anymore. Apparently, audits of wealthy individuals have plummeted. And now people focus on auditing poorer people because, both those terms are both very loaded. I'm not sure exactly how this works statistically. Maybe poorer people or people who are, making $100,000. Because it's easier to audit poorer people. And it would take a long time to do an audit on like Mitt Romney. So, I just don't want to do it so much anymore. So yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for things to improve pretty dramatically, not even necessarily with new legislation, just in providing the IRS the resources it needs to enforce the regulations it's already got, the laws and regulations it's already got. Logo Cool Extreme asks, are you being censored for talking about American politics on YouTube? It worries me that an American company is censoring an American citizen instead of criticizing his country. The whole conversation about censorship on YouTube, I think, is inaccurate. YouTube is a private company. It can decide what it wants to put forward. Is that private company absolutely deciding that they want to only let legacy media, they are consciously privileging legacy media like, NBC, CBS, CNN, Vox, whatever. Are they doing that right now? Absolutely. And YouTube is entirely within their rights to do that. And it pisses me off. It hurts my business. It really bothers me. If it weren't for the COVID thing, I'd be doing a very big fundraising push right now. But I can't really justify that right now. So that's why I'm trying new strategies to try to get more people to sign up for Patreon. Like YouTube's choices that they're making as a business are killing me. Because I can't get, when I talk about U.S. politics, I apparently can no longer get more than like 3,000 views, which is a real pity because obviously I want to talk about U.S. politics this year. And it's not just Google, it's Facebook. A key part of what I do here is I put a certain amount of money towards advertising each of these videos. It's like, maybe $30, $40. I can't advertise US politics anymore. If I were to formalize myself as like a 501c, probably not a 501c3, but a 501c9, like give myself an address and an organization and that kind of thing, then after I jump through a whole bunch of hoops, then maybe I can do what every politician and dark money group can do. But I can't do that. And I'm not sure I'm entirely interested in that. So no, like YouTube is not censoring me. Like censorship, First Amendment violations, those are things that the government does. Because of, I think, largely in reaction to more liberal complaints, like, I mean, people don't really remember that it was actually Hillary Clinton and her camp that coined the term fake news. And like worried about, Russia and social media. Like, I think I will have a video on that before too long. It was a reaction from the social media platforms to that politically driven effort against independent voices. So I don't actually tend to, like, I'm not going to get all Trumpian and be like, these Silicon Valley companies, they're censoring me, man. Like, they're reacting to a political environment that was created just as much by the Democrats as the Republicans, probably in some ways more. Created by establishment voices who wanted to crush the smaller ones. I mean, that said, like, I grow my subscription base all the time. I promote, it's going to go slower than I thought it was going to go. And I haven't given up yet. And there will be a big fundraising push at the end of the year that will actually, because, I need more funds to pour into advertising for the things I can advertise. One of the nice things is I can advertise videos about history. I want to do more videos about history anyway. So that's a plus. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that it's sad what has happened to the ability of the individual to get media out there on these platforms. But for me, I have to remember that it's amazing that these platforms even exist. And I think I am giving up my apartment in New York City pretty soon. I'm going to start auditioning some cheaper cities. And if I do live in a cheaper city in the United States, then actually, like, it's not quite to the point where Patreon, gives me enough to eat and run a business, but it's close. It's close between Patreon and advertising and book sales. But I can't live in New York City anymore. And even in living in New York City, I've got 4 20-something roommates. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to be whining to the people who actually helped me with this, who have chipped in. Very grateful to the 5 of you that are watching. Yeah, I think this was fun. I enjoyed sort of rushing through all this. I hope, Loga and Mert and Farzan, the folks who've been here, who've been here the whole time, I'm super grateful. I think I'll do this every month. I got 1 new patron out of it, which is, exciting. If you enjoyed this, if you could actually go to my YouTube channel and I posted that I had a patrons only live chat coming up. You can just like post under that being like, I enjoyed this. That might be helpful. That's like on the community tab on my YouTube channel. So maybe some people sign up for it. If you didn't enjoy it, I guess also let me know. Yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? Was this a good format? Was this worth doing? Was this interesting? Let me know. We've got another 5 minutes. Farzam, I noticed there was a formality. We're talking about that non-aligned idea. A formality is in they would be non-aligned on paper, but actually aligned with one superpower behind the scenes. But that's the thing, like they don't have to be. Logo was talking about this earlier. The fact that these countries are so much richer than they were. When we were dealing with this US versus the Soviet Union, most of the countries in the world were coming out of a period of formal empire where they had been, robbed blind. And in the 60 years since independence movements, some countries have become spectacularly more wealthy. Many countries have Many countries have not, but every country has developed the resources necessary to participate more fully on the public stage. So the non-aligned movement in the 1960s, I mean, India was dirt poor. Like when the non-aligned movement got started, you got to realize that the whole like Asian tiger idea didn't exist yet. South Korea was by the 60s wasn't as poor as North Korea, but it was still a very poor country. Like Indonesia, the Philippines, all these places were not we're not serious economic powers the way that they are today. So yeah, I'm really warming up to this sort of new non-aligned movement idea. Because yes, the non-aligned movement, and I think I was arguing with a very Zionist buddy of mine on Facebook, and I think the non-aligned movement like has this like they're like a boogeyman for the for big Israel supporters because they were like, hey, yeah, we don't like white people beating up on brown people. And that's a sad way for like the non-aligned movement to be remembered because I think it was a potentially very powerful thing that was undermined by the fact that all the leading lights of it were from very poor, very poorly organized countries. That's no longer true. Like a real non-aligned movement today could like, yeah, I think there's a video I got to write. It's good. Questions. Thanks for the brief, says Farzan. The exclusive video makes us feel special. You are special. You guys feed me. It's important. I'm very grateful. I will do this every month, and I hope you guys show up. And actually, yeah, if you wanted to leave comments on the Patreon thing as well, that might be positive as well. But I was thinking on the YouTube specifically, because I would like this benefit for patrons to convince more people to show up. So on the community tab on my YouTube thing, if you would be willing to do that. Mert says he enjoyed it. Happy to hear that. Easier to interact with you and other patrons. Thank you. He's volunteered to make the note. Local Cool Extreme. I got to ask, once Trump is gone, will celebs remain apolitical, or has he turned them permanently on the Dem side? I don't know. I think there's a great possibility for some relatively charismatic Hollywood figure to go be the guy who resurrects the Republican Party. I don't think it's. I mean, I think there's a lot of completely justified anti-Trump groupthink, but I think that's going to fade with a less loathsome figure in charge. And I think a lot of celebrity types recognize that when it's not as an obvious villain as Trump, it's they're a little out of their depth when they talk about politics. And it's interesting because I mean, it's not like celebrities were right-wing before Trump. I mean, it's not something. I have this weird theory about actors and conceivably sports types too, is that they have this sort of, they end up as celebrities hanging out with a lot of legitimately very wealthy people, but they're not necessarily, with like 5 to 10 exceptions a decade, they're not necessarily very wealthy themselves, or they're not like plutocrat wealthy. So it's sort of interesting why all these actors end up like as crusading left-wingers. It might be because they actually hang out with a lot of really wealthy people and see how undeserving they often are, and yet are not very wealthy people themselves. It's just sort of a theory I was bouncing around. Yeah. Well, of course, Taylor Swift has come out and publicly condemned Trump. About time. And that's important. But who knows? Local School Extreme asks, so why have more and more white, well, that's a very loaded question to end a 2-hour thing with. So why have more and more white Americans suddenly started supporting BLM? And is it Black Lives Matter? And is it bad that the main reason I began supporting it was because of the support of white people like you? I don't think it's, well, that's a lot in that question. Why have more and more white, I think more and more white Americans have suddenly starting supporting Black Lives Matter is because of cell phones. It's a simple, straightforward technology change. Because it's not like cops weren't killing black people all the time before. It's just that when they wrote down in their police report that, this person had a gun or this person, did this or that, the other fucking thing, everybody just sort of reflexively believed them. As far as like why you trust, why you started supporting BLM because white people, I mean, that's you know, a little grim, but also it's because white people have more power in this country and in world society at large. And like that's not like a white supremacist thing. It's just like a financial thing. Like there are I mean, there's some, but there aren't as many. You know, middle-aged former lawyer stockbrokers who decided to get passionate about politics and started a YouTube channel. You know, like it's that there are more white people that have the resources to get out and say these things, and I think anybody in any country has a despite the homogeneity of many nation states, or at least the consciously crafted, there are minority groups in every region of the world, and I think people tend to be suspicious of the minority group presenting a version of reality, and will give it more credence if someone who does not directly benefit from that interpretation is putting it forward. I think that's natural. I don't think you should. I mean, it's something to think about for sure, but I don't think it's something you necessarily have to feel bad about. All right, so it has been 2 hours. I thought this was fun. I'm definitely going to do it next month, and hopefully more people will show up and do it. It's you know, it's a lot of fun and a very weird experience to do this for 4 or 5 people. But, hopefully next time it'll be 5 or 10 people. But I hope it stays at a nice level. I would have to be doing very well on Patreon, I think, for this to become an unmanageable level of questions. I like that I was able to like really interact with everything. So thank you so much. You know, I do my whole spiel, but you guys know my whole spiel because y'all are patrons, and I'm really grateful for that. Like it's how I eat. So yeah, thank you for feeding me, and thank you for showing up and helping me workshop ideas. Like I think I'm definitely going to do a non-aligned movement. I need to find a book on the non-aligned movement. So anyway, thank you so much, and hopefully we can continue the conversation over at Robo Law, or yeah. Thank you so much. Ending stream now.